Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. We will be talking about the 5 steps to doing security automation right. My name is Karen Crowley. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager with TwoFin, and I have with me today Joe Schreiber, who is a Technical Director at TwoFin, and he's going to do most of the talking today. And Joe will introduce himself in just a minute. A few housekeeping items before we start. All lines will be muted during the presentation, so if you have any questions, please enter them into the dialog box in the BrightTalk console. The webinar today should take about 35 to 40 minutes, and we also have some links to additional resources in your console, so you can take a look at those as well if you'd like to have any additional resources. One is an automation journey infographic to share with your management team. And the other are some examples of automation integration videos that have been done with Nessus, ServiceNow, and BMC Remedy. And with that, I think we'll move on to get started. So our agenda today, we put this agenda together based on some questions that we had. So this is the agenda that we thought would make the most sense, and we really wanted to be answering on our audience's questions. So this is why we put it together in this way. We're going to talk about the automation opportunity, automation versus orchestration, and what's the difference, going through how do you get buy-in and getting started, some real examples of automation, and then next steps in getting practical. So at this point, I will turn it over to Joe, and he can get started.
All right. Thank you so much, Karen. As was said, my name is Joe Schreiber. I'm the Technology Director here at TwoFin. We have the webinar titled 5 Steps. I hope we can eclipse that. I'm trying to get a whole flight of stairs worth of tips here in for you guys, including the agenda here. But just as important as what we're going to talk about, I think it's important to understand who is talking to you as well. Those that know me have titled me an automation zealot. I strongly believe a lot in automation, so much so that I have my own catchphrase below, which is twice and never again, which refers to the amount of times before I do something before I enact automation, right? And that's really important to me. In my lifestyle, I try to automate as much of all my business tasks, home automation, all over the place, as much as I can, really. And you probably heard, funny stories about automation potentially taking you out of a job or what have you. And I can tell you from experience that I've literally done that on multiple occasions. Quite actually automated myself out of quite a few jobs. Just to give you an idea of what that meant and how long I've been doing automation, I can tell you one time I was tasked with doing a Office update and rollout, that is Microsoft Office, right, which is long before SaaS products and so forth, which meant you actually had to physically go to every console generally and update these things. And so when I got this task, my first question was, you literally want me to walk over to 150 desktops, put in a CD, run the installer, wait, and walk away. I don't think that's very efficient. So I said, well, hey, why don't we do an unattended installer, put it in the login script for folks, and have them update when they log in. So I was able to test that concept and actually roll it out, and I got, not only did I get 90% of the rollout done in an automatic fashion, I also knocked 2 months off of the contracting position, which meant I no longer had those hours to bill. But as they say, right, as one door closes, another door opens, and the recruiting company actually put me on bench time at that time, so I was able to actually do a whole lot of other small gigs and so forth. So although I was able to essentially automate myself out of a job, it opened up opportunities to find many others. So never be worried about that. And for further credence, I have automation code both running at businesses and at my house for over a decade, unaltered, right? So reliability is a key aspect to automation, and I think over 10 years is a pretty good record. All right, so why am I so excited about automation? And the first and foremost thing is that you can literally do more through automation. Automation has actually been helping out our economy for the last couple decades, right? That is the ability from a manufacturing standpoint or what have you, in order to do more or produce more with the same amount of labor force, right? So it's a great opportunity to expand what you can do from a capability standpoint and even a domain standpoint. Additionally, you know, in our field, especially in my older days when I was an administrator, that was just full of routine tasks, things that you would do every single day. And automation can free you from that burden, right? The ability to do these things automatically with consistency. Additionally, I remember I also had a buddy one time. He was on call for infrastructure, and every time the developers would push a new code set, it would cause the web servers to need to be reloaded. And he would get a text message. Remember back when people actually carried pagers and so forth, he got a text message. He'd have to go and log in and actually address the problem. But it got to the point where he just automatically started rebooting the web servers in response to that. And I said, well, hey, why don't you automate that? And so we worked on it. We used that trigger, created the action and so forth. And then he never actually had to do that step again. And that step would often wake him up, right? And sleep, for me, super important, super critical to my functioning in society. And so anything that's going to help me maintain my level of sleep or help others get more sleep is clearly an advantage. So what does automation mean for you personally, right? I mentioned the thing about routine tasks and so forth. And when you do that, you can actually decrease or mitigate some of the boredom inside some of our jobs, right? We all deal with that. That's a great, you know, long-term strategy, right, to keep yourself happy with what you're doing and how you're doing it. Additionally, right, automation, if you're able to prove value and actually do more, as I said, you're going to get more visibility inside an organization. So it's a great way to get yourself noticed if you want to go that way. And with all this great kind of free time, you know, releasing yourself from these common tasks, you can actually do other things and new things. And especially in information security, there's always something new to be researching and learning, and automation can help you gain that time to do that.
Great, thanks, Joe. As everyone can see, we've got a real expert on our hands. We do want to make this as interactive as possible, and if you do have questions throughout the presentation, please enter them into the console, and we can address them as we go, and then we'll also take questions at the end. So when we looked for questions, one of the ones that came up often was the idea of automation versus orchestration. And these terms, I think we see them a lot today. A lot of vendors are using them. We see it a lot in articles that are out there. And I think people have confusion about what's the difference between each. So I'm going to turn it back to Joe to explain that concept.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we find that folks will often use these terms interchangeably when in fact they do represent discrete kind of task and output here. So let's define that, right? So automation is really focused on a task, right? That is removing manual aspects of a task so that it is done without human intervention. So perhaps you need to create a VM. You know, normally you would go into your console, click around, create it, set it up, verify it, and so forth. But with APIs and scripting and so forth, you can automate that task, right? Remove the human element out of that. What follows next is actually orchestration. And orchestration is focused around process, right? That is a series of tasks or a grouping of automation in order to accomplish or complete an entire process. So the previous example about creating a VM may be one step in a larger orchestration process that is provisioning an application, right? So you're going to follow a series of steps and so on to get to the desired outcome that you choose. And the reason that I bring this up and we talked about the distinction, one is to clarify the terms, but ultimately remember that automation inevitably leads to orchestration, right? It's going to be a rare thing for you to do and create one singular task and use that task and be the only one that uses that task. Ultimately, the goal is to replicate and automate existing processes that are followed in your business today. Change management around firewall policy, security policy, and so forth. This is a great example of that. And understanding these processes is really important from the back end side. That is, who owns these resources? What data is available to you from these resources? And I think most importantly, what is the satisfaction criteria for this orchestration that you're trying to complete, right? Because if you go through the time and effort to replicate a process and so forth, and it doesn't actually achieve the result that you originally were replicating, you kind of wasted your time here, right? So you want to make sure that those people that are involved in the automation and orchestration validate the steps that you're doing, so that when your automation and orchestration are enacted, there's no discrepancies about the output and so forth.
Great. So another one of the popular questions that was asked when we were developing this webinar was getting buy-in. Sometimes there may be cultural resistance within an organization, or sometimes many of the more technical people were asking, they didn't really know how to approach the subject, either with management or how to get their other coworkers on board. So I think Joe has some great advice for us all.
Yeah, absolutely. Orchestration in particular, it's in a way like a group activity, right? You're not going to be able to maybe accomplish the full orchestration or process without interaction with other business units or other management and so on. So being able to be upfront before you commit to doing the integration and so forth is very important. And getting folks to understand the benefits and machinations of what you're trying to do are very important. So I try to always tell people, try to speak in context of the folks that you're speaking to. So in this example, we're talking about management, right? So automation has a whole long list of benefits that you can go and use to talk to management about, but keeping it in their terms is important as well, right? So if we're removing manual processes, we're clearly increasing the speed of what we're doing, right? In business terms, that's often referred to as agility, that ability to move quickly and turn and so on. If we are removing manual steps, we're also removing the labor and time associated with those steps, which is a cost reduction. Additionally, because less humans are involved in the automation and orchestration, we really mitigate the amount or potential for mistakes. And in the business world, we call that business continuity, right? We do not want to interrupt business, whether it be from an automation standpoint, an inadvertent mistake, right? We want to keep the business going. Additionally, automation and orchestration can often be a front end to other software or other databases and so forth, giving you another layer of access and restriction or role-based access control, et cetera, et cetera. And all this can be part of a zero trust or least privileged mentality if your organization is moving to that, and ideally that they are. Now, additionally, from a broader perspective, folks are often calling automation projects digital transformation. You'll see that word very often on websites and marketing materials and so forth. And so using that can help you get buy-in with it. Same with process improvement. And then automation can also give you the ability to start deprecating things or decommissioning things that are no longer necessary, or automating legacy systems out of the picture. That's very important from a technical debt perspective as well. Now, when you talk to automation with your peers, it's also good to think about that in their context, right? So I've always been a big fan of the novelty aspect. That is, what new tools can I use? What new languages can I get exposed to? What new vendors can I work with, right? That is a very exciting thing, whether you're using an automation or orchestration framework or new programming languages and so forth. Automation orchestration is going to give you the ability to start doing functionality and information exchange, right? Reducing friction between organizations, making the ability for you to work together even smoother. But one of my favorites to tell people is that you can actually remove yourself from an existing process, right? That means, hey, I don't have to get on that conference call and validate that that happened. Or I don't have to write the audit or the document trail ensuring that what I did has proof and so forth, right? That can all be part of the automation strategy and a component of the automation work. And then additionally, right, we all have goals, right? We all want to get these things completed. We have projects that maybe we've been working on for years that have been hampered by time, resources, and so forth. And that automation can take back some of that time and give it back to you and potentially increase the scope of the projects that you're working on.
Thanks, Joe. I think one of the big questions on everyone's mind is, how do I start automating? Or if I've already started some automating, how do I advance it? So with all the talk about automation, there really needs to be a game plan. And Joe, you talked about automating yourself out of a job, and I think we'd all like to sleep better. So how do you advise people to get started themselves?
Yeah, as I say, I like to say the use case is everything. And I also say this kind of out of a cautionary tale because my zealousness around automation often caused me to automate things that, quite frankly, didn't need to be automated, right? There was little or to no value into automating these things. I couldn't reuse what I was doing, or maybe whatever I automated was highly specific to me, so it wasn't possible to share it and so forth. So it's really important to understand why you're doing what you're doing before you do it. And asking this simple question of, why am I automating this, right? Is it solving a problem that I have, that others have? If I do and commit to this level of work, can I reuse this in another project? Can I use this in a larger orchestration play, right? Perhaps I want to go back and automate all that VM creation, make it, put a lot of options in it and so forth. That could be part of a much larger orchestration around, rolling out different applications or services and so forth. And then also think about the difficulty of what you're trying to do, right? Because if it takes you more time to create the automation than you're going to save in the long run, right? It doesn't actually net out, right? It could cost you more time up front. So be very clear on what you're trying to automate, how you're automating it, and actually take the time to kind of write these things down. You don't necessarily need to make a super detailed plan, but a basic flow diagram or series of steps can really help you understand what kind of resources you may need, right? What languages may I use? What APIs will I interact with? If somebody owns a resource in another BU that I have to go and get access to, permission to use it, et cetera, et cetera. Because there's nothing worse to getting maybe, through step 1, 2, and 3, and then the whole project is on hold because you're waiting for a ticket to be closed or access to be given and so forth. You want to make sure that you can smoothly conduct your automation. And then additionally, look at each step and think about what happens if it fails. And this is a really important thing to automation because you want to leave the environment the way you left it with automation. So for example, what we've been talking about, creating VMs, rolling out software and so forth, perhaps you get to the point where you've rolled out the VM, you're ready to push code to it, and then you realize the code is not there anymore. Maybe you get a 404 or it's not valid or some other thing is stopping you. Well, then what do? Right? Do you leave the VM there and wait for the code to come available, or do you roll back the change and destroy the VM and so forth, right? So these are key questions that you should ask and account for in your automation. All right, we'll take a little segue here to answer this question that came from the audience before we started broadcasting. Definitely feels like a Tufin user here for sure. And the question is, what are some common automation use cases for network policy? Clearly, I think the first couple are going to be access provisioning and access removal. That is generally what most folks are trying to do, right? They're trying to get to something or perhaps remove access from something that's no longer functioning. But there's also administrative things like rule recertification, right? Asking yourself why these rules are in the firewall in the first place, and then validating them through business processes and so forth. And then there's the individual elements, right? Object usage. Are these things still in use? Do I want to remove granular parts of rules through server decommissioning? Or perhaps I want to replicate access through server cloning, right? And these are important to keep in mind in terms of orchestration because it's highly unlikely you're doing these with a single policy enforcement device, right? They may be cloud, on-prem firewall, SDN, what have you, right? And so understanding how you're going to orchestrate these things from end to end is a really important aspect.
So in the vein of solving real problems like you talked about, a big theme in the poll that we took was don't just talk at me, show me some real examples. You know, we had a range of people who've tried automating before to those who haven't started yet. So Joe's going to go through some real examples.
Absolutely. Okay. So as we talked about earlier, right, that is define your use case, write out the steps of your use case, right? So in this case, I created a real life scenario here. That is, I want to connect to the Tufin orchestration suite. We have an API. I can use that to get the list of devices and also their configurations. Once I get the configuration, I want to write it to disk and repeat that process. So this is the automation task that I want to perform. And now we want to look at the code that we would use to do this. And so this is some real code. You can actually find the first incarnation of this actually on my GitHub. I'm not sure necessarily if you want to use this in production, mind you, right? This is example code. But really what I want to show here is how we write this code for reusability. So what you see here on the screen on the left side is the code that I had to write in order to accomplish this automation. And in this case, I go out, as I said in the steps, I connect to Tufin, I grab the first 5 devices, and then I take their configs and I write them to disk. And you can see the execution of that step there on the right when I run this Python script. Now, there's a couple problems with this, right? So this works great for me, and I run it on my own laptop or what have you. But now I want someone else to use this code, or I want to give the same functionality to my coworker. And there's a couple problems with this, right? So the first thing is I have credentials embedded in the script, which means someone has to actually go in and edit the code, which could potentially be a dangerous proposition. And then also the functionality is essentially hard-coded, right? The first 5 devices are hard-coded in there. Where I write the backup or give it a file name and so forth, all of that is hard-coded here. And I would have to understand how this code was written in order to make those modifications. So the first thing you may do in order to get reusable code is to take the functionality and turn it into discrete functions. And what you see on the left side of the screen, again, is all the raw code that I would have to write in order to do this integration, this script and functionality. And you can see at this time, I've actually created a function for the actual backing up of the config. So now I actually have some influence over the input and output, right? I can choose which file names and locations and so forth. I've given a little bit more functionality. I've also changed over to including the credentials, right? So now no one has to modify the script to supply their own credentials. They can be done outside. They can be put in a git ignore and all that other good stuff as well. And so in the middle is what your coworker may have to write, right? They're copying your functions into their own scripts, and then they're running their own logic. And then you look at the execution here on the right side and notice that it's identical, right? Even though I've changed the structure of my code, the functionality still remains the same. But there's an even better way to do this, and that would be to take advantage of a class inside of Python. Now, again, on the left is all of the code that I've had to write. And if you notice, I'm not really writing a great amount of additional code here. My backup function pretty much remains the same. I add a global handler in there to connect to Tufin, and then I put the device or get device functions as a discrete function as well in the class. And so if you look at the code in the middle, what my coworker has to write, basically they're putting the include line at the top to have my code in there, and then they're creating a class, and then they're doing the same functionality again. But in this case, they have a little bit more control, right? They can actually choose which devices they back up. In this case, I've said, hey, can you show me or back up, sorry, all of my firepower devices in this example, and you can see the execution there on the right. So in this instance, my coworker didn't really have to understand the functionality. The input model there is pretty obvious and so forth. So that person, the next person, and the person after that has to write very little code, which means they can get started with automation even faster.
So next up is, how do you share your automation? So this was a great question in terms of making it real, your organization. So if you automate a task, how do you share it and make it repeatable? And this is one of the biggest challenges that can determine the success of automation at an organizational level. So Joe, can you walk through that process?
Of course, and I think one of the caveats, right, to automation becomes the code maintenance, right, and the sharing of that code. And as soon as you do that, you get this whole litany of questions, right? Where's your code live? How do I build the environment for it? What are the dependencies? What if the code needs concurrency? What if I don't like the functionality of the code? How do I modify it, and so forth? And the problem with that is that you can get into so much more administrative overhead of running your automation versus the value that it's bringing, that it makes it moot, right? So in order to get over that hump, I advocate for what's called a service-oriented architecture, or SOA. SOA is a very old concept. I mean, it's over 20 years old. In fact, Amazon started dictating SOA back in 2002 as the sole method for business units to communicate data back and forth. And if we look here at the properties of SOA, I think you can start to see a lot of the value here. So the first part is this idea that you're taking your functionality and creating a discrete business function out of it. That is, you're not making kind of a Swiss Army tool here. You're making a singular function and you're putting it in a self-contained environment so that you don't have to worry that something else may interfere with it, or someone may, as a person, interfere with it as well. And then from the consumption point of view, no one has to be concerned with how you wrote that integration, right? Maybe you wrote it in Python and a company uses PHP, or vice versa, or what have you. All of that is moot because the interaction to your service has nothing to do with how it was created. Now, from the personal side, right, when you create this service, it gives you a broad ability to begin sharing that integration as part of a larger orchestration, perhaps, and then the ability to use these cross-platform and cross-vendor, right? If we're talking about maybe HTTP invocation here, most vendors support things like webhooks, web calls, and so on. Very easy to get your code inside of other products. And then because you have a singular distribution point, it's easier to keep current and actually start doing instrumentation, right? Basic administration. Is it up? Is it down? Is it slowing? Is usage increasing? And so forth. All of that is great information and great feedback that you get automatically just by running the service. Now, some of you say, wow, that must be some really complicated overhead, right, to get my functionality in terms of a service. Well, in reality, it's not. And if we take the same example that I've been using earlier around reusable code, here I can import my class that I wrote, unmodified, right? This is the exact same code from the example before. And I use a library in Python called Flask. And you can see I'm wrapping about 4 or 5 lines of code around the code that I've already written. And when I run this as a Flask app, I immediately have an HTTP endpoint. And you can see on the right side that I can simply just call this with curl. So anyone who can make an HTTP request, or any product, can now make use of my integration. And I give them the ability to choose the device that they want to do that. And of course, you could extend the service with more parameters and so on in order to bring that functionality to your other users. Now, in terms of environments or where this code can live, there's a lot of great modern ways to be housing your code. The first would be containers, something like Docker or Vagrant. this ability to create, very much like SOA, right, these self-contained environments for you to actually get your code out there and get it up and running very, very quickly. Since you're not mingling with other processes and so forth inside a container, you don't have to worry about whether your libraries are compatible, your software, what have you. And then you can possibly take advantage of some of the orchestration side, like Kubernetes, to scale your automation up to many, many other endpoints and so forth. You can also take advantage of cloud native services, right? These X as a service, they may be doing things that you need in your organization. You can take advantage. They have very little setup, if any at all, and of course they're in the cloud. Now, the finality, where a lot of code is starting to go now is more of the serverless side. That is, let's skip the containers, right? Skip the cloud native, and just take my code and upload it to maybe Lambda on Amazon or similar services on Azure and so forth. And the great advantage here, one is that you only have to worry about your code. And two, very often you pay by invocation of that code. So you don't have to have administrative overhead just to house your code when you do serverless. Just simply someone calling it would charge you a penny or something like that. So very easy to get up and running. Very deliberate focus on just the code as well.
So along those lines, a big challenge that has come up is putting automation into practice. And I know we had questions on APIs and tools. So Joe, what are your recommendations there?
Absolutely, yeah. So we've gone through the what you're going to automate, right? You've created that use case. We've talked about methodologies to automate that. And so now I really want to get practical here and figure out how I'm going to do these things. And so the first is to look at the APIs, right? So the APIs are going to be your main interaction point with your vendor products, your potentially data acquisition as well. And most APIs are written in what's called REST. REST has a very clearly defined behavior, meaning if you learn one REST API, the ability to learn the next REST API becomes that much easier to do so, right? They have a common kind of input-output type model. And there's a lot of tools to help you. One of my favorites would be Postman. Postman is free. It gives you the ability to explore and poke around with APIs before you start writing code, meaning you can understand kind of what input and output that you're going to need to do in your automations. In fact, and Postman can even export out code in a variety of languages once you get there to actually accelerate the development of your automation. Then additionally, I would start thinking of your automation in automation terminology, right? That is looking at these definitions here and figuring out how your logic flow equates to those, right? So you'll hear the term trigger, which means how am I launching this integration, right? What has it started? Is it someone inside a portal doing it? Is it a reaction to an event from a SIM or a monitoring platform and so forth, right? Understanding what that trigger is and the information contained in that trigger. A condition dictates when something should run. Maybe it's a time of day or particular have you. That can be used to potentially gate automation as well. Actions are going to be that series of tasks that you're automating. That is maybe create a VM, do a git pull, whatever it is, those series of actions. And the reason that you think about it in that term is that you can reuse these actions, right? You want to make them generic and so forth so that you can maximize reusability. And then also the ability to query and modify state of objects. That is, what is the current state of the resource you're interacting with, right? Is the server up and down? What is the version of it? And so forth. And these are variables and so forth that you would query and use in the logic of your automation. And then lastly, you saw me do a few programming examples in Python, but I should note, not all automation and orchestration platforms require you to know programming or even do programming. Tufin Secure Change, in fact, is a completely GUI-based workflow system, so you can actually do your orchestration and automation without writing a single line of code. All right, and then from a practical standpoint, how do I get started, or what's the first thing I should automate, and so on. And so I I prefer to start personal, right? Start with the high value things that affect you and your job first, and then migrate out to the business. And so to understand what you might want to potentially automate, as I said earlier in the very beginning, repetition is a key target for automation, and redundancy, right? Perhaps you're doing a task that your coworker is also doing, or another BU is doing something similar. If you can remove redundancy, you can also save labor overall as well. And then I always try to start with the high value targets and work my way down. And so how do you determine value? Definitely a big fan of XKCD. He talks a lot about automation in his comics. And he put together this really clever chart which kind of shows you the time savings when you look at the frequency of your automation and the length of the task that you're trying to automate. And so a lot of people, sometimes they ignore the 1 minute task or the 3 minute task. And if you end up doing those on a frequent basis, 5 times a day, 10 times a day, those really add up on a year basis and so forth. And all of that is time you can reclaim back. But also, when you're doing that automation, remember the things that I said earlier about reusability and the bigger picture of orchestration. So, for example, change management is a large-scale orchestration process. Many folks are involved in it. There's many approvers, maybe different technologies that are involved from an end-to-end perspective. And it's really important to understand that that aspect of automation and orchestration won't happen overnight. And there's certainly a journey that you can take. And I'll hand it over to Karen so she can talk more about that.
Terrific. Thanks, Joe. Just as a reminder, I just have a couple more slides we'll go through, and then we'll take questions. So if you do have any questions, you can enter them into the BrightTalk console, and we will address them. So looking at the bigger picture, so how can automation be implemented, at your organization to make a real difference? And the graph you're looking at is a maturity model for automation, and it's centered around network security policy management. So to moving from manual processes and a lack of visibility to really maximum security and agility. So if you're all the way to the left, you're really focused on security. You're very secure, but you're probably moving too slow for the business. And if you're all the way to the right, you're really agile, you're spinning things up really quickly, but you're assuming way too much risk. So what is that balance between the two that will help you increase your operational efficiency while also improving your security? And some of the things Joe just talked about in terms of value, if you're down here in this lower left quadrant, you're lacking visibility into what's happening within your firewalls, cloud workloads, and processes are slow and they're still very manual. So your business probably isn't very happy. So the first step is really gaining visibility into the network. Looking at that from mapping your network topology to see the path of your firewalls, your routers, your cloud workloads, and then extracting policy settings from your security tools into a single pane of glass that'll create one centralized policy across your organization. So from there, you can move into doing some automations like Joe mentioned, like rule and server decommissioning, a group object modification. Those are tasks you can do that start to prove automation at your organization. At this point, it's also more easy to prove compliance because we're starting to document what's happening. You have visibility into that, but you've got that base automation, and you want to move into some more sophisticated automation, like risk analysis, automating your risk analysis and change design before it happens. So understanding things like what will happen if you add a new rule to your firewall. Does it already exist? Does it violate any existing policy? And do you want to make an exception to that rule? Do you still want that rule to run even though it violates that policy? You know that you need that to run. So being able to account for that and doing that in a very systematic process. And And it also helps you to further prove compliance. So you can prove when the auditor comes in, you can say, yes, we made this exception, and here's why, and we understand it. But we also know that, you get to this point, you have created a better foundation, but the business cares about applications. They don't care that much about IP addresses. So moving into a little more sophisticated automation, being able to do application-driven automation to ensure applications are also provisioned according to security policy, no matter where they live, whether they're on-prem or in the cloud. And ultimately, this maturity model allows you to move to a zero-touch automation processes where things can be fully automated end-to-end according to your risk tolerance. And that allows you to really balance your security, agility, and your security. And TUFIN's mission, just a little TUFIN commercial, is to manage that network security policy and automate the changes according to a consistent policy baseline. That weaves across your legacy, your next generation firewalls, to physical networks, private and public cloud platforms, and containers and microservices. So really creating a continuum from the macro to the micro to manage your security policy no matter where it lives, and automate and orchestrate those changes. So that's what we have for today. We can move on with questions, and I just want to remind the audience that there's links to download. We have an automation journey infographic there that kind of walks through that maturity model process, and also some links to some videos for integrations with Nessus, ServiceNow, and BMC Remedy. So Joe, we have a couple of questions. One was around DevOps, and their DevOps teams are using automation for applications, but from the security standpoint, they don't have visibility. And so as an organization, that would be an issue.
Yeah, so in DevOps, right, some of you may have heard this idea of shifting left, right? That is the idea of bringing security closer to the development process. And in fact, these development processes have undergone a great deal of automation, right? Especially when you talk about CI/CD, right? That is a completely virtually automated process. And the ability to add more automation functionalities is where you can essentially insert more security into the process, right? Whether it's static code analysis, vulnerability checking, and so forth. And all of that can be done before the application is even deployed, right? So this ability to get security and get security teams involved early on is a key concept of the shift left movement.
Thanks, Joe. Another question, this person says, I've tried scripting, but it's failed overall. What recommendations do you have?
So, the idea there is around reusability, right? This ability to share your code and so forth, or the service or the functionality of that code. That's very important, right? So if you essentially end up writing an automation that no one is using, or only you know about it, right? Clearly, that's not useful to the rest of the business. And so this goes back to getting everyone involved in the orchestration and automation process so that they understand and have a good sense of expectations and so forth on what you're delivering and so forth. And that's very important, because if you keep doing these things in the shadows, you'll just stay in the shadows.
Thanks. So I think we have time for just one more quick question. So this person is asking, how would I test my automation before putting it into production?
Great question. Testing, very important aspect to development work in general. Most of the time now, when we think about writing modern code, people often write more code around testing or creating what they call unit test, which is essentially setting the behavior of what you expect to do and then running those tests against your integrations. Then the second difficulty becomes replicating your production environment, right? That's often one of the biggest hurdles, right? So, I have this piece of software in production and I want to orchestrate it. I can't be doing that stuff in production, right? It's all about business continuity and so forth. So finding an achievable test platform is another key aspect to really making sure your automation is tested effectively.
Terrific. So we're just about out of time here. I just want to say a big thank you to Joe for giving us his time today and talking about automation. If you do have any questions, you can reach out to Joe at his Twitter handle. And if you have any questions for Tufin, we can be reached at www.tufin.com. And we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the feedback, for the very informative talk. Appreciate that.